Thank you, Dana. Can you all hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We're on too. Can you all hear me okay?
Okay. Thanks for coming. Our presentation is called Object-ifying UVA, and then there's a long subtitle that I forget. But something of that.
Seeing it through the lens of.
Seeing it through the lens of current events. Thank you very much. You are shaming me already.
I always like to embarrass the lecturer.
Yes. So what we're going to talk about is this book that I wrote called Mr. Jefferson's Telescope, which was written on the occasion of the Bicentennial of UVA, and then was turned into an amazing exhibition by Molly and her colleagues at Special Collections that you all can go see for free in the Special Collections building while you're here this weekend. So we're going to talk a little bit about those two things and some of the conversations that have come up out of this interesting collaboration, and then we're going to have time for questions at the end. But you are also willing to shout out questions, corrections, challenges, or just insults while we go. So, here we go. This is the book, and as Molly has held up, this is Mr. Jefferson's Telescope, A History of the University of Virginia in 100 Objects. It was published last year by the University of Virginia Press. And I thought it might be worth saying a few words about how it came to be written. It started out as a cover story in the University of Virginia Alumni Magazine. It was 2 or 3 summers ago, if you can remember back that far. And they did a history of UVA in like 50 objects. And so an editor at the press saw that and said, okay, we want a book with 100 objects. Brennan, we're going to need you to come up with that list of 100 objects. And instead of writing 100 words about each object, write 500 words. And do it in 4 months. And so that's what I did. And it was a really interesting process because you don't have a lot of time to overthink the process in 4 months. I took the 50 objects that the magazine had, and then I went and talked to the historians and the curators and special collections people that I knew, and just said, what should we put in this book? And when they talked, I wrote, and when I got up to 100, I stopped, and I started researching. And so this book has everything from the number 1 object, which is, as you might have guessed, Mr. Jefferson's Telescope, which was, it belongs to the folks at Monticello. It was believed to have been used by Jefferson down on UVA grounds from the terrace at Monticello while UVA was being built. We got everything from that to a Barbie doll, a UVA Barbie doll, which was acquired by Special Collections at UVA. They heard that this was coming out, they went to Toys R Us and stood in line and got one. Why would you put a Barbie doll in this book, and what does it have to do with anything? I'm just going to leave that to you to read. It's got everything from the Barbie doll to a strip of James McConnell's downed biplane from World War I. He was, as you may already know, a graduate of UVA and was the person memorialized by the aviator statue. Was it? Yeah, outside Clemens. And we've got number 88 here, which was the last Easter's t-shirt. Before that was banned by muddy and disgusted university administrators. And number 80 is what was called a Bice device, which was created by Raymond Bice, who was a sort of legendary figure around ground, psychology professor, but also an administrator.
Did anyone attend that last Easter's? Yeah, so we had somebody show up at the exhibition opening wearing that t-shirt. So it was in the exhibition case, and some guy came wearing it.
That's amazing. I hadn't heard that. Do you still have t-shirts from?
My daughter has
Oh, that's so cool.
it. So what is the?
Okay, so,
Yeah.
Can we extend the program, please?
Okay.
Easter's, go ahead, please.
Classic Easter's is a 3-day weekend, dance weekend, including a formal, as in tux, on Saturday night with named bands, several during the weekend. Many of the events were held at Mem Gym, okay, in terms of the central events, but it was the wildest fraternity party weekend you'll ever see. And it failed because people could walk up from Ohio and goons from Chicago should show up and become drunken idiots. And it just gave the UVA any number of problems, including a really bad name. Okay. So we prefer to do heavy drinking on our own here in Virginia, for UVA homegrown sorts. It was you had a date from out of town because they were very few towny dates you could get. And you had, nurses were invited, yes. And then you had all kinds of dinners and parties and so forth and so on. It was a wonderful time. There were 3 of them. Easter's was one of my favorites.
In 1982, that doesn't quite describe what he's
It did sort of morph evolved. It transformed in a bad way to something that was maybe just like a giant muddy mess in
Lambeth
Magpul.
Field, Lambeth Field is where we had all of the events.
Yeah, and there'd be so much mud going back to the dorm that they would clog up the pipes. Anyway, Easter's. So from Jefferson's telescope to a Barbie doll to the plane to the Easter's t-shirt device. And we also did try to include portions of UVA's history that are not as fun to remember, that are sometimes difficult for us to talk about and confront. In this case, this is a picture of an enslaved woman named Sally Cottrell Cole, who was born at Monticello and was enslaved at the University of Virginia. So this gives you a sense of what's in the book, and I'm going to pass it over to Molly to talk about what's in the exhibition.
So I decided to make this into an exhibition when I ran into Brendan at a Christmas party, and he told me this book was being written, and I said, how many of the items are from special collections? And he said, I don't know, about 3/4. And so it was an immediate decision. I thought, this is going to be so much fun. And it was a really interesting experience transforming a book into an exhibition. The book is in linear order chronologically, so the numbers represent the historical spread of the objects, which go all the way up to the present. And we couldn't do that in the gallery because the objects are all different sizes, they have different environmental needs. We learned a lot working on this exhibition about the environmental needs of non-book and paper objects, which are not what we specialize in special collections. We specialize in books and papers. But we had things like objects made out of rubber, like the Bicentennial. And it turns out, you don't want rubber and silver in the same exhibition case. You'll notice if you ever used a rubber band to put a bunch of silver spoons together, for instance. Don't do that, not a good idea. So it was a really fantastic, exciting learning experience for us, transforming this book into an exhibition. Among other things, we decided we weren't going to stop with the gallery. A lot of the objects in the book are not actual objects, but buildings, or things like the gardens behind the pavilions. So large things that at first we thought, oh, we'll put photographs in, but well, that's not very fun. Why not send people to go see the Homer statue, or to see the minor bust at the law school? So there are actually 21 objects at 16 satellite sites. Come on in. if you want to come. Oh, you don't have to, but I mean, you're very welcome.
We didn't want to interrupt.
We're done. So there are 16 satellite sites. So as you're walking around grounds this weekend, and we have a bunch of brochures you can take with you. There's a map, and you can sort of find all the items. It's really, really fun for us in Special Collections. We've never done anything this ambitious before, so it's a pretty exciting experience. You'll see here another view of the gallery, and you see there's the photograph of Sally Cottrell Cole, which in reality is, very small, daguerreotype, is blown up to the size of one of our windows. And next to that, you'll see another window is covered with these little pink and orange dots.
Question?
Oh, yes, question.
Oh, how long is the exhibition?
It's running through June 22nd, so you can see it this weekend, but it's been up almost a whole year, so it's still up for a little bit longer. You see those little dots, those are actually Post-it notes. In fact, those are facsimiles of Post-it notes. This is the kind of thing we do in the Special Collections. We collect everything we can relating to university history. Those Post-it notes, the originals, were left on the doors of Peabody Hall, next door to the Special Collections, in the wake of the article that was published in Rolling Stone magazine, which I'm sure you all know about, which was later debunked. But the original article sparked a massive student protest about issues having to do with sexual assault in the university campus community. And students wrote their thoughts about sexual assault in UVA on Post-its and left them on the door. And our university archivist got permission from the students who planned that particular protest to, at a certain time, gather all of the Post-its, and we took them into Special Collections, because that's what we do, we document university history. So when Brendan decided to use them in the book, we then decided to use them in the exhibition, and we have a wonderful student assistant in Special Collections who cut out every single one of those facsimile Post-its, and then they stuck them all up on the door. So really exciting to be able to sort of try and give people a tangible connection back to the past. And as Brendan said, and I think sort of understated, because I think the book is incredibly impressive in the way that it is both a celebration of UVA and a critique and a sort of thoughtful interrogation of UVA as a concept. And there's so much interest right now in these issues, and the book does a beautiful job of really thinking carefully about what the nature of UVA's reputation, for instance, is, and where the challenges through history have lain. So one of the most important and satisfying things to me about the project and making it into an exhibition is, when you're working with someone else's stuff, you don't get to choose it. And that produced a lot of challenges for us logistically with some of the objects. But you also need to inherit the ideology of that person. And Brendan's approach to the book, which was one I totally agreed with as a curator, was warts and all. I believe this is the phrase that Brendan has used at many points in time. And we found that to be an extremely successful approach. My favorite thing to do every day when I get to work is to check the comment book in the gallery. And this is my favorite comment. I don't know who Gail Kasner is, but she said this exhibition made me think in new ways. And I think 3 people in the entire 9 months it's been up, have said, there's too much negative history in this. Or one person, I think, didn't like that we referred to, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, the events of August 11th and 12th, and said, I think there's too much contemporary history. There were a couple sort of uncomfortable moments of people saying, this isn't the UVA that I wanted to see when I came to this exhibition. But I've been so pleased because we've had very few comments of that kind. The comments have mostly been, thank you so much for telling the whole story. And Brendan's going to get back to this concept of the whole story in a moment. And I think, too, that it's this idea of thinking through objects that people have found incredibly interesting. Why is a Barbie doll interesting? Barbie doll is interesting for a lot of reasons. And encountering that Barbie doll in the context of a history exhibition makes the Barbie meaningful, or in the context of the book, in a way that the Barbie on its own, as a toy in a toy chest, may not be as accessible as something that's intellectually interesting. So it's really, really been fascinating. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brendan to take this idea and take it a little further.
Well, going back to the Barbie doll, that Barbie doll was on the list of my 100 objects. It got on that list just as soon as a curator at Special Collections said, well, we've got this Barbie doll. I said, okay, that's on the list. That seemed interesting. I had no idea what I was going to say about it. But because it was number 93 out of 100, and because I was writing them in order, I knew I didn't have to worry about it until I got there, right? And so what was kind of interesting about the way in which this book was written is that what I had to say about that Barbie doll, number 93, was going to be completely dependent upon what I had to say about objects 1 through 92, which I also didn't know what that was going to be when I started. But one of the things that happened as I was writing is that these themes and these connections and these narratives started to develop by looking at these different objects. And one of those themes was this idea of what the University of Virginia was supposed to be from the beginning. It's something that over the course of its history, students and faculty and administrators argued with one another about. And for a long time, and to a certain extent still today, a vision of UVA is in some way articulated by saying what UVA is not. And UVA is not State U, right? Yes. We're different. We're not the thugs from Chicago. I'm from near Chicago. But so what became interesting to me once I got to that Barbie doll is what is more State U than a Barbie doll cheerleader, sports cheerleader. UVA struggled over its history farther back than I would have guessed when beginning the book, has really struggled with what role sports should play, and struggled with the idea, and this is, back to the early 1900s, struggling with this idea that sports can take over, that sports can overcome the kind of ethical, scholarly foundations that the university was supposed to be about. And so the idea that UVA and everyone that's not UVA all sort of felt comfortable about this Barbie doll just shows you the sort of transformation of the school and its image of itself, at least on one level, over the years. The reason these books are up here is that one of the objects, and I don't think I planned this, I don't think this object was on the list when I first started, but these 5 volumes are a history of the university written by a man named Philip Alexander Bruce, who was himself a graduate of UVA and a historian, and he was commissioned on the occasion of the centennial of the university to write a history. And his history came out in 5 volumes. And that was just the first 100 years.
Let's put this up in contrast. 5 volumes of this.
Right. He had a little more to say about UVA than maybe I did. But I consulted those 5 volumes quite a bit when I was working on the first half of my book anyway. And I consulted Bruce and quoted from Bruce so often in my book that I felt like he had become a kind of character in the book. Well, let us now consult Bruce to find what is the most hyperbolically positive thing anyone could say about this professor. But he was also a very serious historian, and as you might imagine, these 5 volumes are thorough and exhaustive. They're also a little exhausting. But one of the things that struck me about this is that Bruce really had a very firm idea about what the University of Virginia meant, what it stood for, what its relationship to its founder was, and where it ought to go in the future. And at the end of that 5th volume, he articulated this. He talked about Jefferson's unerring vision. He talked about how Jefferson was unfailingly correct in his ideas about the university. What struck me then as I worked on the next 100 years of the university's history is how those years seemed in many respects to be nothing if not a repudiation of a lot of the foundational views of Jefferson and Professor Bruce. I mean in terms of the role of race at the university. Should African Americans be students? The role of women at the university. Should women be students? Jefferson would have said no and no. And Bruce would have said no and no. The third thing that the next 100 years would struggle over is the role of elites and elitism at the university. I think that Jefferson founded the university in large part to educate elite white men in how to be leaders. And he understood that this was crucial in a democracy, that you create the leadership class. But over the years, the role of public education has changed drastically. So that in the 1950s, the president of the university then was Colgate Darden, and he was pushing to include more public school kids to come to UVA. So much that our friend Raymond Bice actually created a computer that would allow the university to crunch numbers to help Colgate Darden bring in more kids. This got a lot of pushback from faculty and students, so that one faculty member was quoted as saying, "Wait a second, are you saying that you just want to make UVA a catch-all for any kid from Virginia who wants to go to college?"
God forbid.
And Darwin was like, yes, that is what we want. And we sort of laugh about it now because it's so obvious that that's what a state university ought to be. It's never been obvious that that's what UVA wants to be. Whether you talk about African American people or women, but also just, what is the role and meaning of an elite school, a public Ivy, if you will, versus a school that brings in a broader swath of people. I personally don't have a strong opinion about what's right and what's wrong there. The point is simply that that's something that UVA has struggled with. The Barbie doll kind of speaks to that. But these 5 volumes speak to that in the sense that at the 100-year mark of UVA's history, you had a historian who felt comfortable really sort of writing 5 volumes with total certainty about what UVA is and what it means. At the end of 200 years, I feel like we are at a place of uncertainty where it comes to UVA's history, what it means, what our relationship is with that history and is with Thomas Jefferson, for that matter. And so in some respects, thinking about my book versus Bruce's 5 volumes is just a kind of symbolic way of suggesting where we're at.
You're making me think about Edgar Allan Poe, that, coming to UVA, even at its founding, and attempting to play the game of the UVA elites, and not having enough money to do so. And it really isn't until Colgate Darden that kids, extremely smart kids who are competitive intellectually, who really are, the brain trust of the working and lower middle class are really supported at UVA, right? That it's until then, it isn't until then really that there's a safety net for those kids. The creation of Newcomb Hall as the center of social life at the university versus the fraternities, which are a site of privilege and which cost a lot to belong to. So, Poe has to drop out because he doesn't have enough money to party with the big kids, with the rich kids.
And it's still left behind a library fine.
That's right, which is in the exhibition.
33 cents.
It's in there. Go to the gallery to see it. And it's just really interesting because these, you really do see this constant struggle, but it really is in the last century that these massive shifts have occurred. And yeah, I think that the point Brendan makes about his book versus this book is really a great one. This is a narrative told with confidence and clarity in one voice. This is a compilation of objects that are sort of speaking what is obviously just one version of the history. That, when you have 100 objects, there's something sort of absurd about that, right? You can't tell the University of Virginia's history in only 100 objects. Well, that's the whole point. This concept comes from the British Library. We are not the first to do this. The British Library did a big exhibition about 15 years ago called, I believe, History of the World in 100 Objects. It's a wonderful concept, right? I mean, don't you want to go see what a ridiculous thing that's going to be? What on earth are they going to choose to tell the history of the world in 100 objects? And the whole point is, of course it's impossible, but the objects that you choose and the narratives that you choose set your history.
And even the order that you put.
And the order yes.
I would say, I feel like I could, throw this all on the floor and rearrange it, put them in a different order, and then different connections emerge from one object to another, and different narratives emerge. Yeah,
exactly. So it's really just fascinating, and so starting with that sort of issue, that reality is sort of how do you choose what objects tell your story and which history you tell? I want to tell you a story about one of the objects in the exhibition and how that object was utterly transformed the weekend before the exhibition was meant to open. So one of the objects that we have here in Special Collections is a Klan cross. And this was chosen for the book by Brendan for good reason. It's a pretty compelling object. It was owned by a woman named Sarah Patton Boyle. Some of you may have heard of her. She was a Charlottesville resident who was a faculty wife. She was married to a professor of drama. And in the mid-1950s, during this incredible moment of integration, of the fight against integration at the Charlottesville schools, the fight against and for integration in at UVA, she became a civil rights activist, and a really interesting one. She wrote a great memoir about this. And at one point, during one of the various struggles that went on in Charlottesville, this cross was burned in her front yard as a threat. And she kept it. She took it from her front yard and hung it on her living room wall as a symbol and a remembrance of what had happened to her and what the civil rights movement was all about. And she donated the cross to the library when she donated her archive to the library. So this is a great item to have in this exhibition because it represents that moment, the 1950s, this other side of the 1950s. You have Darden democratizing the student community, and then we have, this fight, the massive resistance to integration in Charlottesville, and this object sort of, you only have 100. This is the one object that represents that particular struggle. So as we were working on the exhibition and trying to figure out, how to display this cross, this item actually ended up taking more energy for conservation purposes than anything else in the entire exhibition. It cost more to care for and more to display. It needed a custom case. It needed a lot of care. It's been burned. It's falling apart. Little bits fall off of it every time you move it. So we spent a lot of time and energy on this. And as we were coming close to the exhibition opening, we had two things happen in Charlottesville. There was a sort of torch rally in May of 2017. And then in July, there was a Klan gathering. And we started getting a little bit anxious. We thought, well, we were going to put this Klan cross in our gallery. What's going to happen? So I met with Brendan and the Dean of Libraries. So we had a new head of special collections coming in. She hadn't even started her job yet. She talked with us. We all sort of had to discuss what to do because we were getting a little bit anxious about putting this very, very distressing and disturbing object on display, especially in the era of social media, when you don't know what's going to happen to that object if you put it on display. So we met, we talked about it, we decided, you know what, we don't want to compromise ourselves, we're going to put it on display. It's important, we don't want to hide this history, but we'll be cautious about how we display it. So we decided to have a warning outside the gallery so that people wouldn't be traumatized by encountering this object. I can imagine that if you've experienced having a cross burned in your front yard, let's say an elderly resident of Charlottesville came in the exhibition and had that happen, an African-American resident, and encountered this, that might be pretty traumatic. So we want to make sure to warn people. And we put a big sign, I wrote this big label about why it's on display, why it's in the collection. And we had it on a black background, so it'd be hard to photograph. We didn't want it to go viral on some Nazi, whatever. And the exhibition was supposed to open on August 14th. So August 12th, I'm at a conference in California, messaging with all of my, colleagues and my boss saying, we can't open the exhibition with the cross in it. And on that day, I was worried about that telescope, which we borrowed from Monticello, and other precious things that were shared in the gallery with this. I was imagining people throwing things, breaking cases. This was a violent day, and over the weeks that followed, the potential for violence did not seem like an issue. But it's important to remember what it's like in that moment of crisis when something like what happened here in Charlottesville happens. Total crisis. We waited. We decided to delay the opening of the exhibition. Everything sort of stopped at UVA that week. I mean, if you were here, if you live here, you know that. Everything just sort of ground to a halt, and everybody was sort of in shock as we kind of tried to figure out what had just happened in our town. And then by the end of the week, we realized we didn't want to display this item. The community had been appallingly traumatized and violated. There had been a death, a murder. We didn't want to put this object of hate on display. So we decided to leave the case in the gallery. You can see this is what it looked like, empty, with a sign on it explaining why it wasn't displayed. And then we added 2 items to the exhibition, which were images from the community response to what happened on August 11th and 12th, including this really incredible, remarkable vigil that was held the week after. Everybody gathered on a nameless field. There were about 5,000 community members. And I was there. It was a really, one of the most profoundly beautiful experiences I've ever had. And we marched the same path that they had marched across grounds with candles and then sang, "We shall overcome," and the good old song in front of the rotunda. It was a profoundly moving, unifying event. So we decided we'd put protests in the gallery around this case and make a statement. That's not usually what I like to do as a curator. I want to be objective and separate myself, but this was not a time for objectivity. And so this is what we did with the gallery. It really was an amazing experience to be opening an exhibition on the history of UVA right after these events occurred. Because of course, immediately, August 11th and 12th changed how the whole world understands Charlottesville and UVA. In fact, if you look you can go on Wikipedia. They have this amazing tool in Wikipedia where you can find out about the analytics of people using. So you go to the Charlottesville page and you see the analytics, and it's like this, pretty reasonable number of people, and then there's a spike the week after, and it just goes right back down. The whole world was looking at us, and our university was transformed. So what we'd like to do now is talk a little bit about how those events and other events that have occurred from the time that the item list was finalized until the exhibition opened, how that exhibition has sort of been reshaped in our minds by that, and how maybe if this exhibition was opening next year instead of last year, let's say 10 items. We decided to choose 10 items that maybe would be included in place of, not in place of, but maybe just in addition to some of the ones that are already there. So we have the cross. We were donated tiki torches, and we took them. We had six different people offer tiki torches to special collections, and they all contacted me. And my first thought was, I don't want, no, you don't want these. That's disgusting. That's appalling. I don't want those. Those don't need to be kept. And then my intellectual brain came in and said, yeah, we have a cross that represents the particular kind of hate that was experienced here at one time. We'll take these in. So we actually have 3 of these in the collection as documents of what happened on August 11th. 101st object. Yes.
Are they brand new?
They were found in the trash cans behind Alderman Library. Yeah. So they were actually used. Brendan, over to you.
This is one of the objects in the collection. It's a cape worn by a nurse who had attended school at UVA as part of the medical school. And so we were thinking about this object and nurses at UVA when this happened, which is one of the buildings here was renamed this past year. The previous name was Jordan Hall, and Harvey Jordan was a dean of the medical school, and he also happened to be a big proponent of eugenics in the early 1900s, which was a pretty mainstream scientific thing to be back then, and there were multiple people at UVA who were important in that field. But it's also a science that has become discredited and a little ugly in retrospect, and so the decision was made to rename that hall for a woman named Vivian Pinn, who was an African-American woman at the medical school in the class of 1967. And so it's really taking an object like this building and just deciding we're going to think about it differently now. We're going to ask you to think about it differently.
In fact, it's sort of like the university is an exhibition, right? Every building has a name that represents a moment in history, and you just pull one name out and put another name in when you decide that there's a different story you want to tell about your history. She went on to be a quite prominent physician, and really is a quite noteworthy individual. This is the, you want this one, Brendan? Yeah.
This is the Homer statue. And does anyone know who created this statue? Who the sculptor was? The sculptor?
Yeah. Good call.
Moses
Ezekiel.
Moses Ezekiel was a Virginian who was the first Jewish cadet at VMI. And he went to school there during the Civil War, and he fought with his fellow cadets at the Battle of Newmarket, famously the battle in the Shenandoah Valley that had, school-age boys marching across the field. He then later studied sculpture in Europe, and he did that, and then he also did the Jefferson statue on the north side of the rotunda, a statue in which Jefferson is holding up a tablet or something that has lots of different names for God on it from different religions and different cultures, because Moses Ezekiel was very tuned in to the religious freedom aspect of Jefferson's thinking. For obvious reasons. He did not always have an easy go of it as a Jew in Europe. Anyhow, one of the reasons why this photo stood out for us is that in the weeks following what happened last summer, there was just this interesting back and forth about the meaning of Jefferson as kind of embodied in this statue at UVA. You might remember that original Friday night August 11th, as the dudes with the torches are coming off the lawn, there's, a group of students here sort of encircling this statue as a signal or a sign of resistance to the guys with the torches. And in that,
Which is just so great, right? Because I think the guys with the torches wanted to claim that they wanted to sort of, to protect Jefferson is almost a kind of ironic thing for those students to do, right? Because the goal is to keep up the statue downtown that represents Robert E. Lee. So the goal is for the white supremacists who come is to keep the statues up that represent white supremacy, which is supposedly an inheritance of Thomas Jefferson. And here we have students who are opposed to that white supremacy who are protecting the sculpture of Thomas Jefferson. It's a wonderfully complicated, layered moment.
yeah, well, and it becomes more so because then a week or two later, a group of students, covered up the statue with the black tarp and used it as a different symbol. Again, in that moment, it's a symbol of white supremacy. And for this, what it meant to me, it's less. I'm not so much interested in staking out my territory about who Jefferson was and what he means. We can all sort of do that for ourselves. But what's interesting to me is that the university, in ways that are maybe more obvious and performative than in the past, is really struggling within itself about what Jefferson means and what it means that this university is founded by him, but it is built around him. You can't really separate one from the other. He's baked in the cake, and I think that the question is, what does that mean, and how do we deal with that? Because there's a lot of amazing upsides to a figure like Jefferson, and those have been rehearsed for 200 years. But there's a lot of things that are more complicated and challenging about it too, and that's something that people are struggling with.
Are there any surveys in the student body to answer that question?
Oh, the question is, are there surveys?
Probably.
The student body.
Yeah, from the
That's a really
student
good
body.
question, yeah.
I don't know. I've been sort of paying attention when I see this stuff pop up in the Cat Daily. And I remember reading a story from last fall about student council meeting kind of erupting in arguments over whether Jefferson was a white supremacist. And it's just, that's just, I think it's actually a positive thing. Like, it's probably not the most fun meeting to be at, but these are, I think, important discussions to kind of chew on, even if, it's not fun.
And it's very painful, I think. For the students, I think that it's a very uncomfortable time politically for everyone. It's incredibly divisive, even within the university campus. There were professors last year who said, nobody should ever quote Jefferson ever again, And it's that kind of, because he's so awful. And that is just the moment we are living in. This is UVA's version of what's happening everywhere, whether it's on the right or the left. And I think one of the reasons that we thought that this object, that this sculpture is so great as an added object is because it has become, these objects become at the center of these conversations and these massive disagreements that are so powerful right now.
But we've lightened it up a tiny.
Oh yeah, we got fun stuff. Oh yeah, this is pretty cool. This is the first women's NCAA championship at UVA, which was in track in 1973.
73 is what I
This is
think.
like right after the women started here. This is pretty freaking awesome.
I didn't go to UVA, so like when I make fun of Virginia Tech, mostly I'm just imitating what other people are doing in order to get approval. And I think about how women have been, doing sports at UVA for like a year or 2 years, and boom, national championship. And Virginia Tech is still waiting for their national championship. See the approval, I love it.
So we thought a really cool addition would be that since this exhibition was finalized, UVA hired its first woman athletic director. This is Carla Williams. We don't know what her object would be, maybe just a picture of her. We don't really have any objects for her yet, but you know.
What did you ask?
Well, we just put this. We haven't met her yet. Have you met her? I haven't met her.
No, but if we were to get an object for her, we would ask her. We wouldn't
Yeah.
just raid her
It'd be fun.
closet.
Yeah. She might not have anything yet, but
No, I mean, I would take that jacket. It's pretty standard.
she's rocking UVA colors. You know, she's got the whole thing going on. So this is Carla Williams. So she's a pretty cool thing that's happened since we finalized the exhibition. Oh, you have to explain this item.
Well, this came from. This is one of the original 50 objects that I inherited from the magazine, and this is the student ID card of a law student, dental law student named Bowie Q. Does anybody know who he is?
We've got our expert over here in the blue shirt.
Baseball.
Yeah, if any baseball fans, he went on to become commissioner of Major League Baseball and one of the most influential commissioners the game's ever known. So under his watch, it was the first night games. It was the first, the league's relationship with the unions changed immensely. Just a lot of things that are almost taken for granted in the modern game and made it as big and financially important as it is today happened on his watch. And so he's just one of a million sort of quasi-celebrities who have come through the law school.
So here's another one.
Who's not so much quasi.
Not quasi. So Antonin Scalia passed away after the objects for this exhibition had been finalized back in 2016. And this is in terrible condition. You can see the tape there. This is a photograph I took from the draft minutes of the Board of Visitors. This is his appointment. This is the minutes from the meeting in which his appointment as Associate Professor of Law was made in 1967. So that's a pretty cool object, looking back from the moment that his term unfortunately ended with his death. His term on the Supreme Court. So that we thought that would be a pretty great item to kind of come off of the Bowie Kuhn item to add. What else do we have? Oh, this is a good one. This is my favorite. Actually, this is one of my favorite items in the exhibition just because it's
Really?
so bad.
It's, you know,
It's so bad.
so good.
And he's really quite good looking. We have a photograph of him. We should have put it in next to this because the poor guy, like, he can't defend himself.
No, so this is an object that's in the exhibition, and it is a student doodle or sketch of his professor, whom he identifies here as our German professor. The man's name was Maximilian Schellinger, and he was, I think, Swedish by birth, Austrian by education, and Irish by mysterious marriage. The De Vere was supposedly came from a woman named Maud De Vere, whom he may or may not have married at some point in Europe. Before he was recruited to come and teach languages at UVA, and in his later years at UVA, he had this really amazing kind of Teutonic beard and mustache. But he had a bare face in his earliest years, and then he taught at UVA for like 50 years. He, somewhat famously, if you've done research about the university, put together a book in the 1870s, I think, that is a list of every student and professor ever to have been at the university. When they attended, when they graduated, if they graduated, what they studied, and what they went on to do. I know, he was a little obsessive, which I can relate to.
We love that
It's a
stuff.
lot harder to do in the 1870s than it might be to do today. And then he kind of went a little like goofy in his old age.
Well, all that list writing really do you in. That's a lot of names.
And he like had some illness and he was taking pills for the illness, or taking, I don't know if he took pills or not, but he was taking some kind of medication, and it may have been behind a couple of really intemperate letters that he wrote to fellow faculty members that actually got him fired.
Do we have the letters? Probably.
I don't know. But it got him
I'm the person
fired
supposed to know that, actually.
even after 50 years at the university. So he's sort of an interesting dude.
But the reason that this is up here is because it's a caricature of him by a student, and that prompted me to say, well, here's an item I would want to add, which would be this is a self-portrait of the political cartoonist Pat Oliphant, whose papers UVA just acquired. So we now have the archive with over 6,000 political cartoons by Pat Oliphant over in special collections. And that, for me, has been probably the single most important thing that happened in the last couple of years, because I had to maneuver that project for 2 years. So my personal choice would be for us to put an object in representing the acquisition of that archive, which is a great addition to our historical political collections for the 20th century. Much better than that student knows what he's doing. Oh, this is a great one.
This is an object also in the exhibition that is a piece of tin that came from the rotunda and was burned in the fire in 1895.
It's a roof tile, right?
Yeah, and multiple artists did this, I believe. Maybe two, but I think more than one. Anyway, came and picked up these tins and then painted on them and sold them as souvenirs. And so this is a painting of the burned out rotunda on a piece of the burned out rotunda, which is pretty amazing.
There's a lot of great stuff relating to the rotunda in the exhibition, and we thought that, of course, if we were to do this now, we want to include a video of the Bicentennial celebration last fall, which I missed, unfortunately, but I saw them doing sound checks and preps. It was unbelievable. They got a company that does these projections. So you can see this picture on the left at the bottom. It looks like the rotunda is on fire. They actually they recreated in slides that were projected onto the rotunda the entire history of UVA. It was absolutely gorgeous. And then they have this, I don't know who captured that photograph up there, but fireworks. It was a really, really magnificent kickoff to the Bicentennial season. And the Bicentennial itself would, of course, be an object. What do we got next? This is pretty good.
Well, Molly and I are the worst people to talk about this object. This is again an object from the original 50, and so I just took those because I didn't have time to come up with my own 50. And so this is something from the original Rouse Hall.
It's a floor joist.
Okay, thank
you. We don't think it's very interesting. And then we did a program last year with this really cool guy from the School of Architecture who was he does design thinking, and he just went on this thing about wood and the foundations of buildings and the underside of the university, and we were both just kind of blown away. He had all sorts of great things to say about this, but both Brandon and I find ourselves being like, what do you do with a piece of wood from a floor?
I was looking at this and I was like, well, I'm not going to say anything about this because I don't literally even understand what it is. But I was interested in what Rouse Hall was. Rouse Hall was one of the buildings that closed off the south end of the lawn after the fire. And this ran really contrary to Jefferson's original vision of the lawn. And so that's an interesting moment in and of itself, is the building of those three structures. But then it was, who's it named for? When we talk about, the ways in which that's significant. It was named for this guy, Rouse. I forget what his first name was, but you can't forget what his nickname was, which was Broadway Rouse. And he was from the Shenandoah Valley. He fought in the Civil War. he became some big kind of businessman after the war and gave a ton of money both to UVA and to lots of other institutions. And in fact, the building that now houses Virginia Historical Society in Richmond, and what is now the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, they've rebranded. That was originally funded largely by Broadway House as what they called at the time the Battle Abbey of the Confederacy. It was a single monument to the Confederacy that was meant to represent the sacrifice of soldiers and civilians throughout that time. So anyway, he was an interesting dude.
And we were inspired by this as an artifact of architecture to recommend to ourselves two further items, one of which would be the soon-to-be lost Cavalier Inn, which will be raised soon in order to make room for, we're not exactly sure what yet, but some kind of wonderful new, I hear all sorts of cool rumors about what they're going to do with that space, but they want to make a more beautiful, entrance to the university when you're coming down from Route 29 down Bennett Street. And so they're going to raise this building. We've been here for so long. I love the little postcard right there. But we don't know yet what we would say. I like the idea of one of those railings, but they'd be way too big to put in special collections. Kind of a New Orleans flair. And then that inspired this item, and it also inspired what we thought, of course, this is one of the concept drawings for the new memorial to enslaved laborers that's going to go in. So those will be two huge architectural decisions that have been made by the university since this exhibition was finalized. So I believe they're going to start construction on this probably around the same time that they start tearing down Cavalier Inn. This is going to be, if you look behind it, you can see the rotunda, and you can see Brooks Hall. And the corner is kind of where 109 is over where the corner is. So it's a very, very prominent, large, kind of circular memorial that has enough room in it for a class to sit in circle in the grass and have a class session. There's a lot of information about this online. It was a really cool project. They had students submit ideas, lots of big student groups. Our architecture program here is just incredible. And so when it comes to planning a landscape architecture project like this memorial, they really did this the right way and came up with what I think is really beautiful. Brendan's a little anxious about the landscape changing.
Was plagiarism ever raised from this?
From the Vietnam War Memorial? No, I don't think plagiarism was raised. I think it is actually quite actively conceived as an homage to that, and I think that they specifically address that as an inspiration for this. So I think, plagiarism is pretty negative. I think that the idea was that it inspired it, and they would be very honest about that. Yeah, the style of that particular monument. This is different in a lot of ways, but is certainly inspired by it.
But that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Oh, absolutely. It was the first thing I thought of too. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
How will the names be?
It's not going to be names entirely because a lot of the enslaved laborers at the university, their names are not known. So I think they're still working on what the full nature of the inscriptions around that are going to be. But that's a good question. There are a lot of people working on this. And they've been doing a lot of identifying of names from the university records that are in special collections, but I think they're still working on that. And based on my experience working in the library, materials will come after this is done, will come to the surface. The history is always being discovered. So my guess is that they're going to treat this as a work in progress, which I believe is also the case with the Vietnam Memorial. So pretty cool project. I'm really looking forward to seeing it happen. But I kind of like novelty, but it sounds like.
Well, I told Molly I was just anxious because it's going to be so different.
Yeah,
It's just like.
it's big, and I love that big empty grass stretch. But I don't know. I'm excited. So this is our last item. This is in the exhibition, and this isn't the greatest photograph because it doesn't show you the postage stamp. But this was a shoe that was sent in the mail to Teresa Sullivan in support of her when she was ousted back in 2012. And this came in one of the boxes of stuff we get periodically from the president's office. So she kindly saved some of the, remember, she and her staff saved some of the memorabilia that came along the way. And so this ended up in special collections. It's kind of a staff favorite, and Brendan kind of had it.
Two people in Des Moines, Iowa. I know, it's random.
They were like, if we could, we would click our ruby red slippers to come and support you in person. So this I found pretty inspirational.
They couldn't find a box in Des Moines, Iowa.
No, they wanted to send, you can send objects to the mail.
Yeah, it's so
legal.
interesting. It's just
Awesome.
really interesting.
But that, I was just like, of course. Who wants to guess why I would choose this, or recommend this, as the 110th object? Yes, our new president, Jim Ryan, is a runner. These are not actually his running shoes. I'm not quite brave enough to email him and say, can you send me a picture of your running shoes? But if I were to have an object representing our new president, I would want a pair of running shoes, because that's what he does. And he did this great event. Actually, I want the running shoes he wore for the event he did during the book festival this spring, which was sort of his informal welcome to the university event, where he was interviewed on stage at Paramount by the guy who owns the Ragged Mountain running shop. They're running buddies and have been for a long time. And he wore running shoes for part of that talk, and it was pretty great. And this is a big part, I think, of his personality. He's super into sports, and he seems like a pretty neat guy. And we have to have an object representing him. And right now, I don't know, this is all I know, running shoes.
So we've got time for questions that you might have, or if you want to throw out to us objects that we should be thinking about collecting for the 300th anniversary. Yes, ma'am.
I have just a quick observation. The British Museum did the 100 objects thing. They have a podcast for every object. So if anyone was actually interested, that's still up on, you can get that very easily on iTunes or anywhere, and you can listen to it. They have it's on their website, they have photographs of each object. You can listen to an hour of discussion of why each object.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I've listened to some of those, yeah.
Yeah, so just.
Yeah. Questions?
I'm sure Ben and I went to the opening exhibition, and you go to the profession by the beginning of the month. One of the big things that has changed at UVA is now become like a entertainment center, between the concerts at the stadium, the JPJ, maybe the very first concert.
Right. Oh yeah, so something that reflects.
That's a great point.
Yeah, something that reflects the big time entertainment.
Like a ticket stub from a Bob Dylan, concert from 2014 or whenever he came. Wasn't he here recently? From JPJ or something like that.
Or like she said, Dave Matthews.
Or Dave Matthews, I didn't have. Yeah.
They had big name bands here throughout the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, we don't have a good representation of that in the studio.
I mean,
Brendan, you gotta go back and do the whole thing over. Talk about it. I really think.
Well, I was looking at old Cad Bailey's part and other periodicals that came out of the university, and someone who wrote a book about a jazz musician being able to see the advertisements for the people who did come through in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. I mean, if I could go back in time.
Speaking of your book, Brendan, just so you guys know, Brendan, wrote this amazing book on Big Spider. But also, his book, Mr. Jefferson's Telescope, is available at the UVA bookstore for your purchase for only $25, right? Something like that. It's not an expensive book. He's not very good at promoting himself, and he didn't say that at the beginning. Yes.
Thank you. When you were talking about books earlier, I thought, and books and visions, I thought of this question. Where do you think the Virginia Dabney history that came out in the 70s fits into your scheme since it came out during the change?
Yeah. Virginia, so in the way that Philip Alexander Bruce is sort of a character in a way in the first half of the book, Virginia Dabney is a kind of character in the second half of the book, because who do you consult among published historians about the first women to come to UVA? you consult Virginia's Dabney, who's this very sort of skinny, proper, 60s conservative Virginia dude who was himself a UVA graduate. He was born at UVA. His great-grandfather was the professor who was murdered on grounds in 1840. I mean, he's connected to everybody, right?
But
And
he's also like, I don't know, I have so much ambivalence about him.
he's so grouchy about
He's so
change.
awful. There's a woman, I'm forgetting her name, who was a really big deal on grounds. She was like the assistant to the dean of students, and she basically ran everything. And she's like, you know, very serious academic administrator, and he's describing her in his book. I was doing another project on kind of women at the university, and he's describing her, and he says, blah, 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 she did this, she did that, the students all went to her for everything, and everybody depended on her great knowledge, and she really didn't have any sex appeal. In the middle of this like description of this totally professional woman's career, he feels the need to say that she just didn't have any sex appeal. And it can be a little jarring to read a book from your own lifetime that's just so retrograde.
Well,
Like, I don't mind that with Bruce so much. It's like, oh, it was 100 years ago. You gotta let it go. But when it's from the 70s, I do find myself being a little bit more.
well,
I would be a bit of a bad mood.
I think Virginia's Dabney was very ambivalent about women coming to the university.
Oh, yeah.
And especially in 1970, the thing that, I mean, he was very sort of grouchy about change, and I am too, and I can identify in a certain way, and sort of, you read him, and his personality really comes through in a way, and I found that even though I teased him a little bit in the book, I identified with him. One of the things that he kept harping on after women came was that he just didn't think they dressed well. And it was just like he was obsessed.
Wait, this is the early 70s, nobody dressed well.
All these dirty hippie girls, he didn't put it like that, but that's kind of what he meant. And it was, I found it to be really funny in a kind of exasperating way. But at the same time, we are really, I personally am really grateful that he wrote the book he wrote. I mean, there's the history in it isn't bad.
Well,
I
the
mean,
whole
it's
thing
not-
about Darden is amazing. Like to capture just how revolutionary Darden was as an administrator, you have to read Virginia, or you have to read Dabney to get that. He does such a good job of capturing that moment and the influence that Darden had, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Bicentennial, 200 objects, does the university ask you on that?
Well, for the Bicentennial, they wanted 100 objects. Thank goodness they didn't want 200 objects.
We're in the middle of it.
Well,
Successful book.
So
you want another 100 by January.
Well, 10 more.
I actually said to my exhibitions coordinator, I said, you know what we could do? I said, in 2025, at the other end of this, we could do the second 100 objects, but she gave me the stink eye, because she had just prepared all this stuff. But I can see it. I can see it coming. I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what we'll do?
A bigger question for me. When we do these retrospective look backs and say that was a bad thing, let's eradicate that from our memory. When we change the name of a professor because,
For the building, and yeah.
because he was into eugenics when that was good science at that time.
Right.
Is that, and when you tear down a statue of Robert E. Lee or Jefferson because they had slaves, do you think that might be dangerous? I've written a little story that they tear down all the monuments, Monument Avenue in Richmond, and then 1,000 years from now, guys are digging up things and they find monuments.
I think that
All about.
yeah, I mean,
And you can forget the things by changing, well, that was nice, so we're going to eradicate that from our history.
well, I think that the question is everything that we remember memorialized by a statue? And the answer is no. very, very small number of things that happen in history have statues. So the question is, what do we decide as a statue, and where do we decide that statue gets to be? And when we make that decision, what are we saying? And I think that, to me, that's where the core of the debate over the Robert E. Lee statue is no one's going to forget who Robert E. Lee is. That statue is not the only thing that keeps Robert E. Lee in memory. My God, there's a lot of Robert E. Lee everywhere, right? In our archives and special collections. In the history books, there are going to be portraits. There are going to be on private property. There are going to be tons and tons of statues and things like this. My question is are we at more risk of forgetting 1,000 years from now Robert E. Lee because that statue is torn down? Or what happens when an African-American mother from Charlottesville takes her 7-year-old daughter to the library next door for some books, and they're leaving the library, and they walk past that, and the mother has to try and explain to her child why the city pays to maintain a sculpture with their taxes on the side of a war that wanted to keep their ancestors enslaved. And to me, the experience of that mother and that child, who I'm imagining, is more important right now than the question of whether or not that means some kind of crisis in cultural memory is going to happen down the road. I feel like the damage that does to the community fabric of people who are on that public property, to me, that's my personal opinion, that's more important because it is an ongoing problem of having public property stand to represent the Confederacy. In a town with descendants of slaves walking through that park. That's just me personally. So I don't think we're at risk of forgetting this stuff.
Well, I just want to say, as a historian, there's a couple of things that we can easily conflate that I think are separate. One is history and how we do history, which is a kind of enterprise where you take sources that are out there and you construct what you know to be accurate narratives out of those sources. And histories can have all sorts of meanings and narratives and arguments, but they're always out of sources and are meant to be factual and accurate. It's really different from the idea of memory. History belongs to historians. It's what historians do. It's what they're trained to do. Memory belongs to communities. And memory is what the community decides it wants to take from history or ignore and decide what it means to that community. So it seems to me that you've got historians writing books about Robert E. Lee and about slavery and making arguments about what it means. And then you have communities deciding what's important to us right now. And so as a community, we can argue about Robert E. Lee statues, and we can argue about what they ought to mean and how the community ought to remember them. And we can use history as a tool in those arguments. But however that argument comes out, in terms of memory, it doesn't change history. History is still being done as it was done before and as it will continue to do. And so memory changes over time, but it doesn't eradicate anything out of history. It just may change the way communities think about themselves.
Right. And this is just one of the many ways that we change our landscape. I'm painting my house right now. It's a 1928 Charlottesville arts and crafts home. And the historically accurate colors would be Kelly green on the front door and shingles and white on the windows. And I'm going full-on California arts and crafts. And I'm erasing that. And we're doing it all the time. The Cavalier Inn is yet another example. So there are all these objects of memory, of which statues, I think, are only a small number. I think we're out of time, so we better, if you want to come ask some more questions afterwards, please come up. And we have brochures and keychains and posters for the exhibition. Please take them. Thank you so much.